Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
We got the thumb icon. If you click on that, that would be great. We got the subscribe button, and we continue to get a subscriber every couple of weeks, which is great. So if you haven't done that, please click on subscribe. And we got the bell icon if you want to get notified on YouTube when our next episode drops. So thanks for clicking on those.
So, if you're new to this channel, each week Todd and I take a moment to talk about the lectionary reading for the upcoming weekend from the Gospels. Our hope is that we talk about those readings in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. That we want our discussion here, our talking, to be just talking, as in justice centered. But we also hope that something we might say back and forth as we converse here on this passage would inspire you alongside with us to do more than just talking. So before we launch into this week's text, though, Todd, let me just say an apology to everyone for last week. I don't know what the technical difficulty
Mm.
was with the sound, but I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that we have all the bugs worked out for this week. If this week winds up like last week, then just hang in there with us. We're going to get it sorted out, but hopefully we've already got it fixed.
Yep.
So what passage are we looking at this week, Todd?
We are in John chapter 20, verses 19 through 31 as we start journeying through the Easter season, looking towards Pentecost. So we're right at the second week of Easter right now.
Yeah, so this passage, and I understand why it's in the lectionary around Easter season. It is another, post-resurrection appearance of Jesus story. But I'm going to be very honest from the very beginning. I struggle with this passage to glean from it really any spiritual lessons or Jesus following lessons or justice lessons. I struggle with this passage making life applications with it. When you understand the timing of the passage and its historical purpose in the early Jesus movement, it's just difficult for me to try to extract. So best of luck
Yeah.
to us this week, Todd. I'm looking forward to your thoughts. I know you're just going to, pull out this beautiful application that's going to blow me away, and
Oh, I
I'm
find this
really
deeply
depending on you
spiritual.
this week.
I converted to Jesus with this passage. No, I'm
Did
just
you
kidding.
really?
No, I did. No.
Wow, I'm shocked already.
No, I didn't. Um, there is part of this passage that I've resonated with, and we'll get to it in a little bit. But I think it was interesting that you and I were talking for a little bit before we started this recording tonight, um, and I think understanding. I think you're walking us through how the figures in the resurrection story multiply from gospel to gospel,
Yeah,
and
totally.
that I think is just it's again, yeah, it's not a huge spiritual lesson, but it's kind of gives you just a little sense of the political development of the community of Jesus and what would become the church. So why don't you take us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So first, and in the chronology, that to the best of our ability, the best of our knowledge, most scholars believe Mark was written first, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. That was the order. The people argue over Mark versus Luke, but for our discussion tonight, it's really not that weighty of an argument. But Mark mentions Mary, but doesn't really say anything beyond that. You get to
In the resurrection account,
yeah, in the
right?
resurrection account,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get to Matthew's resurrection account, and Mary is much more featured, and she's told, and the angel actually speaks to Mary and singles her out and says, "Go tell the disciples and Peter. Make sure you tell Peter too." In the Galilean Jesus community, Peter was the one that had denied Jesus thrice, and so there's that whole dynamic. You get to
Mm-hmm.
Luke's resurrection story, and now Mary is still there, but we add to it Peter. Now Peter doesn't need to, nobody needs to go and tell Peter. Peter's present. He runs there and looks into the tomb and sees for himself. Then you get to John, And John just kind of piles onto it and says, okay, Mary's there, Peter's there. Oh, but Peter stopped at the tomb, and the one whom Jesus loved, i.e., John, now John's added to the mix, to the stories. He runs straight past Peter into the tomb and looks around. And so, when you understand, and you mentioned this word, the politics of the early Jesus movement, by the time John chapter 20 was written, you had all kinds of things happening in the early Jesus movement where different communities were competing for power. Some were just trying to prove their legitimacy, that
Mhm.
they were a legitimate Jesus community, hearkening back to the apostles. Um, and so John's gospel does a good job of um, uh, 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 establishing these different communities. There was the community, Jesus following community, that recognized the apostleship of Mary, who's been there from the beginning, Mary Magdalene. The ones that recognize the apostleship of Peter. And then you come to the Johannine community. That would have been those that recognize the apostleship of John. In our passage this week, there's another apostle that's named, and that's kind of the purpose of them being named here at the end of John, is to give legitimacy to the different communities that that grew up around these different apostles. Thomas is the one that's mentioned in our story this week. He's the one
Mhm.
that's, not there when Jesus initially appears, and then he doubts, and then Jesus shows up to him specifically, individually, and shows himself to him. This was all about establishing people of, and again, you had lots of competing interests at this time in the church. You had the patriarchalists versus the egalitarians. The
Mhm.
patriarchalists are the ones that won out. That's the way of the early church
Mhm.
fathers instead of early church mothers or fathers and mothers or brothers and sisters. You had those that were more that saw the need for hierarchical authority rather than the priesthood of believers. You had those who you had the Orthodox movement versus the Gnostics movement. You had all these different factions in the early Christian church, and that's kind of the purpose of these final chapters in John is we're telling the Jesus story, but we're making sure to name drop along the way to
Mhm.
give these different communities within the larger Jesus movement standing, to give them legitimacy, to give them a justification for their existence.
Mhm.
That's what I
Yeah.
see happening to a large degree in this week's story.
Yeah, and I can see that, and I think it's fascinating because again, those of us who have been in Christianity for quite a while and have heard these stories repeatedly and read these stories repeatedly, we don't though these type of thoughts don't enter our mind. We just say, oh, okay, we're just the questions we ask is, well, which is accurate. We might get bothered by the fact that the stories don't line up with each other, and we're saying, does
Yeah,
that
they
mean
don't.
that some are false and some are true, or why isn't the Bible consistent, and get into those type of questions. But when you start re-engaging with the scriptures and understanding that they are human collections of stories and put together sometimes not just by one person but by committee, and it's out of a community rather than an individual, and there's all sorts of interests and agendas that wanting accompanying the desire to tell the story of Jesus, that they're wanting to tell it in a certain way for a certain purpose. um, it takes you to a whole new reading of these passages that you've never had before, and I think it's good to be exposed to that because it helps reframe what's happening in these gospels.
Yeah, it makes it more complicated when we place upon the scriptures and these stories false expectations. In other words,
Hmm.
we expect the Bible to be something that it isn't. But if we just allow the Bible to be exactly what it is, then a lot of those problems that you just named kind of take care of themselves. I mean, anyone who believes that, the Gospels all tell the same story, as far as even in the details, just have never read the Gospels. You've got,
Mm-hmm.
in some cases, four very different versions of the same story that's being told. Often it's three different versions of the same
Mm-hmm.
story that's being told. We'd be lucky if we have four, but very rarely do they agree in all the details. I mean, think about, I mean, we're in post resurrection, we're in the Easter season. The entire Gospel of Matthew has Jesus, the message of the angels given to the apostles, go meet Jesus in Galilee. He's gone on ahead of you in
Mm-hmm.
Galilee. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where the Jesus movement is now going to grow out of, is this continuation of this Galilean movement. But in Luke, in the book of Acts, it doesn't it doesn't start in Galilee. It's stay here in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And in just a little while, the Spirit's going to be poured out on you, and the Jesus movement will now grow out of Jerusalem.
Right.
All you got to do is look at a map. Galilee and Jerusalem are not the same place. I mean, one's in
Yep.
Judea, the other is the region of Galilee. There was the Galilean Jesus community, there was the Judean Jesus community, and each one had their own version of the Jesus story they were telling that gave legitimacy to their own community. And I'm thankful for whoever put the canon together to at least have included all of them, to make the umbrella, the tent,
Mm-hmm.
big enough
Mm-hmm.
to include all the communities as legitimate Jesus communities, rather than them fighting over which one was the true Jesus community.
Right.
There's room
And
for
if you
all of
want,
us.
and you could be listening to that description of um of these gospels having their agendas and wanting to put the story in their, in their region versus their city, and things like that. But again, we're looking at communities of faith that are actually trying to honor the Jesus story and make it relevant to the people that they are writing to. And so
Right.
you have to say that the motivations most were, of course, I mean, I don't want
There's
to say
nothing
they're
sinister
pure,
or nefarious
but
going
but there's
on.
nothing sinister about it. They're not trying to deceive people. There's not an attempt to try to deceive. They're trying to
They're writing
establish.
the Jesus story for their community.
Right. That's right. And I mean, it'll be the same. It's the same. I mean, if to it's. I'm just. This isn't a real good analogy, but since I've started it, I'll just finish it. The
Run with it, Todd. Run with
well,
it.
you can, for a long time in the West, Jesus was painted in one way,
Okay, sure.
and he's painted white skin and blonde hair and blue eyes, and there was an agenda with that.
That's
That
right.
was that was there was an agenda to make Jesus accessible to the
Europeans.
to the Europeans. It was obviously at some point became more than just an interest in making Jesus accessible. Then at some point it became a tool of supremacy and white supremacy. But there was an attempt at some point. It was more. It's like, okay, this is we're trying. I'm trying to express the presence of Jesus with our people,
Right.
and so he looks like our people. And so we've seen paintings of black Jesus now, and would say, well, Jesus probably wasn't historically wasn't African American any more than he was Anglo-Saxon, but to contextualize it, to say Jesus is, you know, the savior for African Americans, uh, contextualize that's okay. If you want to paint Jesus historically accurate, you make him look, like somebody from Gaza,
That's right.
that type of thing. That would be a historically accurate depiction. But so I think
And
there's.
since you brought it up, I love the Black Jesus, because as you read, like, you know, Cone and Dolores
Mhm,
Williams and it's Kelly Brown Douglas, her book The Black Christ, just a fantastic book
mm,
on showing the history of the Black Jesus. and how Jesus's social location, even though in his day it was Jewish under the oppression of the Roman Empire, if he was born in America during the antebellum time
Right.
period, he would have been a black man on a plantation, or a black
For
woman
sure.
even on
For
a
sure.
slave on a plantation. So I mean, there's meaning to all of these different
Yes.
ways of picturing Jesus.
Yes.
Some of them positive, some of them negative. But I would say that all four, or at least three out of the four, but maybe all four of the canon, the versions we have in the canon, were for the purpose of just encouraging the local Jesus following community. Nothing
Hmm.
nefarious involved there.
Hmm. Hmm. So yeah, I think that's well said. I think it's important context. Um,
That was a good
for
illustration, by the way, Todd. You almost bailed on that illustration, but that was a good one.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I felt better about it after I got through it. I started. I said,
Well, yeah,
but
because the white Jesus didn't turn out too well, but there are other
yeah, sorry.
representations. No, it's good.
I stand by it. I stand by it. I'll take credit for it and the blame. Um, so anyway, all right. So we got so yeah. So we kind of got that kind of mapped out with the why John mentions these different disciples by name, and what's trying to be communicated from the Johannine community. Um, what do you have to say about in 20 verses 22 and 23? You've got Jesus breathing on the disciples to receive the Holy Spirit, and his charge, or not so much a charge, but a declaration statement that if you forgive the sins of anybody, they will be forgiven them, meaning by God as well. And if you retain the sins of any, they are retained.
Yeah, I know there are very old Christian faith traditions that are very meaningful to a lot of Christians, where their clergy has the ability to forgive sins and to offer absolution. And so I don't want to disparage that by any means by what I'm about to say. But the original language here, Matthew uses the language of binding and loosing. And John, it's forgiving, and what's the opposite there that's
Retaining.
retaining, forgiving or
Hmm.
retaining, letting loose
Or
or
holding on
retain.
to.
Yeah,
Hmm.
holding on to. Um, this was language that originally was from the Jewish community, the binding and loosing. That was language that was attributed to those who were in power in their society. They were officials. It was specifically a phrase used for the Sanhedrin. They had the power to bind and the power to loose, and they stood on the authority of the Torah. So it's using this Jewish language to once again establish the authority. I don't read this as Jesus is giving just anybody in the Christian community who has the Spirit the ability to do these things. I think it's a story of Jesus showing up, breathing on these specific apostles
Hmm.
the Spirit, and giving them the authority that they can then pass on to others. But it's a again, it's a legitimacy story. These are the communities that Jesus breathed on. These are the communities that Jesus recognized. And this was a time when, like, the community that recognized the apostleship of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Mary, all that was being marginalized by the Orthodoxy. The Gospel of Thomas, who Thomas is the name we're looking at, that community was being marginalized at that time. There was this stark division between that which was beginning to be believed was orthodox and that which was non-orthodox or unorthodox. And wherever you land on that discussion, the reality is they were having these discussions, and these were the names that were being mentioned as being recipients of this authority that Jesus passed on. Now, how do we apply that today? I think that even though I think in this passage it's specifically for the apostles, it's still true that anybody who bears the name of Jesus, you've got to be very careful, because what you do now represents Jesus in the eyes
Mm-hmm.
of others.
Mm-hmm.
If you choose to be forgiving, they're going to see Jesus as forgiving. If you choose to not be forgiving, they're going to see Jesus the way that you're behaving,
Mm-hmm.
that you're treating them, that you're acting like. So I think there's a reality in these passages, whether it's but that's not an authority thing. Again, I think this story specifically is about establishing the authority of these communities that the orthodoxy was attempting to marginalize.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we can extract from it the reality of being a Jesus follower carries some weight. It's not just about you getting to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
It impacts those around you as well.
I think you've, if people were to go back and find us discussing this passage a year ago, we spent some time, I think, really trying to um, extrapolate some of what you're saying from those verses, and I think the understanding that sometimes, um, and whether you want to say ultimately you're supposed to forgive any sin no matter what, I'm not going to make that argument
Yeah, that's
yay
a
or nay.
totally different kind
But
conversation.
I think what you were saying a minute ago, Herb, about what a church or what individual Christians seem to be, what sins or behaviors or practices seem to really bother them, and what behaviors and practices don't bother them, tell you a lot about uh, their understanding of who Jesus
Mm-hmm.
was and what his message was. And you can see people who don't seem to be concerned about historic injustices towards marginalized people, but they seem to be all bent out of shape on sexual purity and and
That's
other pious behaviors, and believing in a literal, very literalistic reading of the scriptures and the events of scripture, uh, and they seem to get hung up on that versus areas of justice that they seem to not be that concerned about. Might communicate what your understanding of Jesus is and what his priorities were, and it may, you may even unintentionally, without even knowing it, be excluding people from receiving and hearing the message of Jesus because of what you're tolerating and not tolerating.
Yeah, I mean, we have loads of communities, Jesus communities today, Christian communities, faith communities, that, in my opinion, bind that which should be loosed and are spending time loosing that which should be bound. You know what I mean?
Yep.
We're trying to
Yep.
bind stuff that's not intrinsically harmful. Well, right now there are large swaths of Christianity that are just getting behind some of the most destructive things in our nation today.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Loosing that which should be bound and binding that which should be loosed. So again, I think there's an intrinsic application to this
Mm-hmm.
where we can extrapolate an application like what we're doing right now. But again, I think the original intention of the chapter was just to establish Jesus breathed on them the Spirit, and this was the authority he gave them to be the
Mm-hmm.
leaders of the Jesus movement. I will say I don't like it very much because it does establish a hierarchy. It does
Right.
establish that authority stuff. I much prefer Luke's definition of what it means to have the Spirit upon you rather than the Spirit being upon you in John. Now you have authority in the Jesus community. Your relationship to the Jesus community is much like what the Sanhedrin's role was in
Mm-hmm.
the Jewish society. In Luke, what it means to have the Spirit on you in Luke 4:18 through 19 is you preach good news to the poor, you set the
Mm-hmm.
oppressed free, you proclaim, you give sight to the blind, release to the captives and the prisoners. That's If that's what it means to have the Spirit on you, then yeah, breathe on me that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But
Yeah.
it's a little different in this chapter this week. And I'm going to be honest, I wrestle with it. The
Right.
Spirit breathed on you, and now you're in positions of
You're in
authority over
charge.
the
Right.
community. Yeah, it feels icky.
Yeah. So,
But anyway,
okay.
it's there. It's the story.
Yeah. Well, and then we get into the second half of the passage, and you come to the encounter of Jesus appearing to Thomas, and as you've already stated, the key reason for this politically was to establish the credibility of the Thomas community uh, as as legitimate followers of Christ. But there's some, there's some interesting
Yeah, totally.
nuance in this passage.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas is the patron saint of all doubters.
Yeah.
If you struggle to believe, Thomas is your apostle.
Yep. I had always wanted to start a Church of St. Thomas for that reason, because I felt like if there's a church I could pastor, it could be the one that was started by a doubter.
I wish it had left it open ended, honestly, too. To, Thomas eventually ceases to be a doubter and, becomes a believer. And then there's the message, blessed are you. You've believed because you've seen, but blessed are those who believe even though they haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen. There's all that stuff there. But I love the fact that Thomas was an apostle. He'd spent through, all this time with Jesus, however long it was, depending on
Mm-hmm.
which gospel you read, 1 year or 3 years. And and yet he still doesn't believe in the resurrection when he's told. He chooses not
Yep.
to believe it. That's
Mm-hmm.
probably where I would have landed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you've got. I mean, yeah, you've got. I was spending a little time with the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 earlier today, and um, you know they were quite skeptical of the resurrection at the
That's
time
right.
too,
That's right.
and it took an appearance of Jesus to them to become convinced that he had risen. So
There's room for
you know,
skepticism.
there's room for skepticism, and and I think that's um, something that is also undervalued in much of Christianity is um, a recognition that doubt and skepticism are actually avenues to pursuing a deeper understanding of Jesus and a deeper understanding of what human spirituality is practiced and how it's lived out. I think is uh, I think it's important that doubt is honored in the
Mm-hmm.
process.
Yeah. I mean, if you're someone out there who resonates with the ethics of the Jesus story, the values that are taught in the Jesus story, like loving your neighbor and the golden rule, and maybe even nonviolence and those types of things, and including the marginalized and blessing the sharing with the resource sharing with the poor. If you resonate with the ethics of the Jesus story, but maybe you find yourself really skeptical about the supernatural claims of the
Mhm.
Jesus story or the metaphysical claims
Mhm.
of the Jesus story, I would say that's okay.
You're in good
There's room.
company.
Yeah, there's room for you, according to those that were on the road to Emmaus, and according to
Mhm.
Thomas, there's room for you in the Jesus community too.
Yep.
You can be skeptical about that stuff. Just lean into the ethics. Just follow the ethics. Follow the Jesus that you can follow,
Yeah.
and it's okay to be skeptical about the rest. If I were God, two things. If I were God, which is always a crazy statement to make, but if I were God, I would much prefer someone who is trying to live out the Sermon on the Mount and how they related to others, but didn't believe in the wild supernatural claims of the
Yeah.
Jesus story. I would much prefer that to someone who is quite sure about all the spiritual and supernatural claims,
Mhm. Mhm.
but could care less about how they lived and related to others, in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. So
And if you read the, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
So I mean, and if you read the other three gospel accounts of what Jesus' priority was, it didn't seem like he had a big priority on people believing that he was a divine being. It seemed like he was much more concerned about getting people to live out his ethics.
That's right.
So that's not just some humanistic reinterpretation of Jesus. That's actually closer in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, closer to what their Jesus was trying to communicate. Anyway,
And it
it's
might be
the
humanistic too. It's just also what Jesus was about.
right. I'm not trying to denigrate humanism. I'm just saying that this isn't this isn't somebody trying to reimagine and create something that wasn't in the original text. A a a humanistic reading is actually
Pretty
probably
close.
more in line
Yeah.
aligned with the synoptic gospels than evangelical Christianity's interpretation of John is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The second thing that I was going to say was that, you may be skeptical of the supernatural. That's okay. Just keep leaning into the ethics of the Jesus story. And some people will go so far as to say, one day you might believe in those supernatural things if you just stick with it. I don't care if you ever do. You may never believe those things.
Mm-hmm.
But the test in all of the stories is never, what do you believe about the virgin birth, or what do you believe about the
Mm-hmm.
resurrection, or what do you believe about miracles and healings? It's, in as much as you've done to the least of these, my brothers and
Mm-hmm.
sisters, you've done it unto me. That's the test, is how
Yep.
have you related to your fellow human beings, fellow members of the human family.
Yep.
So that,
That's right.
it's wherever you find yourself on the spectrum of belief or doubt,
Mm-hmm.
if you're resonating with the ethics, that's really what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yep.
justice ethics.
Yep.
Yeah. So I like Thomas.
Yep. Me too. Me too.
Anything
Got
else this
anything
week, Todd?
else?
No, I don't have
I
anything
don't.
else.
Let's see how many more phrases we can say at the same time.
All right. 1, 2, 3, go.
Go.
That's it. We maxed it out. So I want to say a quick special thank you to all our supporters out there for Renewed Heart Ministries. If you would like to join them and supporting the work of Renewed Heart Ministries, you can go to renewedheartministries.com and clicking donate. We have a new podcast that's starting. We're bringing an end, actually. We were thinking about just changing the name, but we're bringing an end to the Jesus for Everyone podcast. It's going to end with 500 plus episodes.
Wow.
And we are starting season 1, episode 1 of the new Social Jesus podcast. It'll be coming out in the next couple weeks. I'll tell you more about it here when it's out. And I can think, oh yeah, my book, Finding Jesus, that's still available on Amazon. The social, political, economic teachings of the Gospels. I don't know if there's anything else. Yeah, and again, pretty soon we're going to be having the guy who narrated Finding Jesus for the Audible version. We'll be talking with him. So stay tuned to the channel for that. It's going to be a great discussion. I have a phone call with him on Sunday where I'm going to be meeting with him. And anyway, that should be a great discussion for Todd and I and him to hang out and talk.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Anything
All
else,
right.
Todd? Am I forgetting anything?
I don't think so. Just you haven't complimented my appearance tonight, but that's
Oh,
okay.
Todd, you are
We can
so
go. It's
dapper.
all right. Thank
Dapper.
you. Dapper. Man,
Dapper.
you knew exactly the word to use. Thank you. All right. Now we can end the show.
I want
So,
everybody to note that I didn't ask for a compliment on my appearance because I am the humble of the two of us.
well, good. Now we're both satisfied.
Thanks everyone for watching. I appreciate you putting up with us. Hopefully, something we said this week will be a blessing to you on your journey and in your Jesus following. And just thanks for watching us.
All right. We'll see y'all next week.
All right. Bye, everyone.